Hope you found this kind of interesting. If you do, great.
What is up, Dixie Cup? Welcome to a Thursday Collection Connection, where we're playing that game that's just an excuse to talk about records. It's a game I play with my brother, Plastic Eric, from the Plastic Soundwave Cult channel, and every week, each of us presents an album and talks about it for a few minutes, and the only overriding rule is that the album that we talk about has to relate in some way to the album shown in the previous person's video. Also, I should mention, we talk a little bit about the album that we are connecting to, especially if it's one that we're unfamiliar with. So in a sense, we're a little bit presenting two records, but for the most part, we talk about the first one so that we can make a connection to the new one and continue on with the chain back and forth. Eric every Monday on Plastic Soundwave Cult, and me every Thursday right here. So with that, let's move on. In Eric's last video, he showed Def Leppard's Pyromania album. I'm not a hair metal guy, even though 1983 would have been the time when I was sort of at my hard rock peak as an Iron Maiden fan at the time, and Queen, kind of more of a hard rock vibe, and a little bit of here and there, some Quiet Riot, that kind of thing. And so there was a chance that Def Leppard would have been up my alley, but it was not quite. It's funny, listening to the opening track, which I think is called Rock Till You Drop, but I forget here in the moment, after a little intro, kind of kicks into a very AC/DC riff, and it reminded me of a conversation that I had with my wife years ago about the Cult and AC/DC, and how a lot of what the Cult was about was AC/DC riffs. And it's funny how much image matters, in that Ian Astbury, kind of with his, furs and eyeliner presentation, was acceptable for kind of a burgeoning goth-like kid to like, but AC/DC was just kind of seen as a blue-collar junk almost. But really the primary difference was in the presentation. And so it's funny that with Def Leppard, it's kind of the same. It was probably their presentation as much as anything that turned me off. I never followed Def Leppard. I know they had some huge singles and huge albums over the years. In fact, the first thing I looked into for a potential connection was the fact that Pyromania and its follow-up Hysteria were both diamond-selling albums, 10 million plus copies in the US. And there hasn't been a lot of those. I have used Diamond Seller as a connection before, but Pyromania had the quirk of never quite hitting #1. It made it to #2. And I played around with Van Halen's 1984, another Diamond Seller that topped out at #2 on the charts. But I don't know, it was so close in year and sort of so close in style that I was trying to look for maybe something a little more varied, I guess. So the Def Leppard was not that tough to listen to. It's one of those things where I was like, if I adjust my expectations and I'm just listening to the music and I'm not looking at the band, I thought about another connection was what they made me think of is Long-Haired Guys from England, which is a song by Too Much Joy. But it turns out I had already done the Too Much Joy album Serial Killers previously on the Collection Connection, so I couldn't do that. But in thinking about Van Halen's 1984, which is from 1984, and Def Leppard's Pyromania, which came out in 1983, it flicked on a light about years, something I had mentioned once that we have done on the Collection Connection. Every year from 1966 to 2022, a solid run of years, with the exception of 1983 and 2012. And so in sort of a meta connection, based on our own history here on the Collection Connection, Eric plugged that 1983 gap with Pyromania, and so I thought I would plug the remaining gap of 2012 with my connection. But looking into 2012, it turns out I could see why I hadn't contributed to 2012 album up to this point. I only had about a dozen titles that I bought from the year 2012. I know Tame Impala's Lonerism came out in 2012, but that's one that I've only gotten in the last couple of years, maybe even in just the last year, and I'm not super familiar with it yet. I know people love that album. But a lot of the rest of what I got was from being a member of our local radio station, who had a CD of the month, or a CD of the quarter, really, because I guess it's 4 titles that I have, that they recommended, but didn't necessarily fall right into my tastes. I still have them. So that's a quarter of what I acquired in the year 2012 right there. And outside of the Shins, none of the bands that I actively follow released a new studio album, it seems, in the year 2012. Elbow had a release that was kind of B-sides and odds and sods collection. But for the most part, there were no big albums for me personally in 2012. And while one of my favorite bands, Spoon, did not put out a new album in 2012, it turns out Spoon's Britt Daniel is responsible for 2 of the highlights of what I picked up in the year 2012. The first is a side project. He did a duo with, I don't know his name, I don't remember his name. I think he subsequently joined Spoon after doing this side project, but a side project called Divine Fits, which has got some stonking tunes on it, some pretty good stuff there. And in a more tenuous connection to the album that I ultimately chose from 2012, he produced their second record, and I have their third record. So I'll talk about that in a second. And the connection is Milk Famous by White Rabbits. Milk Famous is the third of the 3 albums that White Rabbits put out. And as I mentioned, their second album, It's Frightening, was produced by Britt Daniel and mixed by Mike McCarthy, who had himself produced a string of 5 Spoon albums. And for the next album, for Milk Famous, Mike McCarthy took over all the roles, and he produced, engineered, and mixed the album. Now, I personally hate it when I read reviews and it feels like a reviewer is sort of reverse engineering a thing that they know into appearing like an insightful comment when they say, oh, so-and-so, yeah, it sounds a little bit like the Beach Boys, which is not surprising because Brian Wilson wrote all the songs, whatever. And it takes a thing that they know and feels like it sort of then backpedals it into, hey, I had this thought. It's a very disingenuous feeling to me. But what appealed to me about White Rabbits was that one of the bands that they made me think of when I listened to them was Spoon. And so this was a situation where I had the thought and came to find out that there was a fairly strong Spoon connection that I didn't find out about until later. The name Mike McCarthy doesn't necessarily mean anything to me. I just looked that up for this here. But I did know that Britt Daniel produced their second record. Milk Famous was the first of their albums that I bought. And it has been in the years since that I completed the trilogy between Fortnightly, their debut, It's Frightening, and Milk Famous. I actually finished up and bought the last remaining album that I hadn't bought yet while I was with Eric at an Amoeba record store in Los Angeles. Now, the other bands that White Rabbits make me think of when I listen to them is a triangulation of Spoon, Radiohead, and Gomez. Now, Radiohead may be the only band big enough to be sort of a universal reference point. But the Spoon sound is very much sort of the riffs, how they ricochet around the rhythm that makes the songs feel a little off-kilter at times and kind of keeps you on your toes. The Radiohead vibe is there. Some songs sound very, very Radiohead from the beginning, but a little bit of the soundscape thing and it's kind of skittering rhythms. They've got some very compelling drum patterns that I think Eric would dig when he listens to the album. And with Gomez, it's that it feels very crafted. My favorite period of Gomez, In Your Gun, and Split the Difference, they feel very much like studio creations, but in the best sense of the word. Spoon records often feel very captured, you know, a little bit raw. These don't feel raw at all. The White Rabbits feel very put together. So different aspects, different elements of these three bands pop through my mind as I'm listening to them. Gomez, Spoon, and Radiohead. And if that is an intriguing set of influences, I would highly recommend seeking them out. They never quite made it anywhere, White Rabbits. So this was their last album, put out in 2012. I guess they threw in the towel. I'm not sure if they've officially disbanded, but it would seem 11 years on that they are no longer a thing. They were a five-piece that formed in Missouri and relocated to Brooklyn, New York, and added another member. So ultimately they were a sextet. So a lot of guys making a lot of noise. And yeah, it was a bright spot for me in 2012. It was enough of a bright spot that when a couple of years later I put together my top 50 records, it just brushed in the outskirts of the high 40s. It just kind of made the list. I don't know that it would if I made my top 50 today, but I still find it a very enjoyable listen. It's a good record. It's a good band. It's a shame that they never hit with the public consciousness. But I will throw White Rabbits, Milk Famous, over to Eric. And you can look for his connection, his response to this video on Monday on the Plastic Soundwave Cult channel. And that's all I have. So thank you for watching, and bye-bye.